Hello, everyone. Welcome. I will just wait a moment or so as people continue to trickle in. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're calling in from, and I will start with a bit of an introduction so we can dive into the new state climate policy dashboard. We can jump right into an introduction. Right before I do, I'll just note that auto transcription is enabled. So if you'd like live closed captioning, that's available on the button at the bottom of your screen. But yeah, continue to introduce yourself in the chat. I'll get started with a bit of an introduction. Welcome everyone to our deep dive webinar on the new state climate policy dashboard that we just relaunched last week. We can get started on the next slide with a bit of an introduction to myself. If this is your first time, my name is Kristen Suarez. My pronouns are she, they, and I am the State Climate Policy Network Manager here at Climate XChange. You can learn more about the State Climate Policy Network at www.climateexchange.org/network. And on the next slide, we can tell you what we do. The Climate XChange is a national organization focused on passing effective and equitable climate policy at the state level. And the State Climate Policy Network, or the SCPN, is one of our main national programs for supporting this state work. We're a network of over 15,000 advocates, legislators, researchers, government officials, business leaders, and more, really all sorts of folks working in and around state level climate policy across all 50 states. If this is your first time engaging with the SCPN, feel free to shoot me an email and let me know if you have any requests for how we can support your work. At the link that I sent in the chat, which I'll just send one more time, climate-exchange.org/network, you can see recordings and recap articles from previous webinars, as well as upcoming events where we'll share state climate policy updates among network members. In these events and across all of our offerings, we really hope to create a space for network members to connect on climate policy and really learn from the vast knowledge and experience held within the national network of state-level climate advocates. So I'll send my email one time in the chat so that you can feel free to reach out to me with any questions. But we can go to the next slide. A couple ways that we can support you in your work, which Ruby will talk about a little more as we get into the dashboard presentation. But Climate XChange specializes in tracking and analyzing state climate policy, as well as providing connections with experts, advocates, and other actors working on issues relevant to your climate policy campaigns. So we can provide example states for climate policies, state landscape analyses, and more. And I'll also send a link to our state climate policy dashboard on its new relaunched website, which is a free tool that powers a lot of our pro bono policy assistance with members. So we can go on to the next slide. Today we have Paula Ferrero-Miani, our Executive Director here at Climate XChange, and Ruby Winsell, our Policy and Research Manager, to walk us through the dashboard. And before I hand it over to them, just a logistical note. Feel free to use the chat box as a space for connection, sharing resources, connect with anyone in the event by sharing your LinkedIn or your email. But also, if you have any dashboard-related questions for our staff, please submit those at any time through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. If you submit them through the chat, they might get lost. And then this webinar, as all of our webinars is being recorded. So if you have to hop off on any point, or you know someone who wanted to make it but couldn't, we will be sharing the recording and slides via email by the end of the week. And so we can get into our presentation now. I'll just go briefly over the agenda. So first we'll talk about why the dashboard, what our goals are, and what problems we see this tool meeting. Then we'll talk about what the dashboard is, some capabilities and possible use cases for actors like yourselves. And then we'll do sort of how. So we'll do a guided walkthrough on the state comparison tool, as well as other amazing features of this new dashboard. Before handing it over to our speakers, I'm going to launch a poll so that you all can vote on what states and policies we will be looking at towards the end of our presentation. So I've just launched that poll. You can select 3 states that you'd be interested in exploring, and 2 policies that you'd be interested in seeing across those states. So I'll leave this poll open for about 3 minutes. If you finish submitting the poll, feel free to take a peek at our state climate policy dashboard and explore that for a minute or two while I just keep this webinar poll open for folks to vote. Thank you so much. We're getting some good responses in. 86% of people have voted, so I'll let that I'll keep that open for another just under a minute or so. And again, if you've already voted, feel free to start poking around the dashboard if you haven't gotten a chance to yet. Alrighty, I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll. So if you're really thinking about the different states and policies you want and you haven't yet voted, put those in, and then we'll go ahead and close that poll and continue with the rest of our presentation. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end that. Thank you all. It looks like Washington, Massachusetts, Colorado, and Michigan are what people are voting for, as well as clean energy standards and emissions reductions targets. So we will go back to that towards the end when we're screen sharing. But for now, I will hand it over to Paula, our executive director, to get us started. And then Ruby will walk us through more of what the dashboard looks like. So hand it over to you, Paula.
Thank you, Kristen, for that introduction. So welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you and present the new state climate policy dashboard. Climate XChange launched the dashboard to address the growing need for an accurate, consolidated, and comprehensive source of information on the current landscape of state-level climate policy. We aim to offer the climate movement a tool containing resources to inform policy decisions and craft the most effective climate policies for states. Ruby, our research manager, will take you through the most relevant features of the tool and walk you through it. And we hope you keep exploring on your own after this webinar, as the tool was very, very intuitive. So Ruby, take it away. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm Ruby Winsell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the policy and research manager at Climate XChange. My main job is managing the dashboard and staying on top of all state-level climate policy developments, incorporating them into the dashboard to ensure that it's accurate and up to date and really useful for all of you. Next slide, please. So Paula mentioned kind of our main goal for the dashboard. We really wanted to provide a comprehensive, accessible, and accurate information on state-level climate policy. The tool is free and accessible to everyone. It's comprehensive. We provide information on 62 state-level climate policies across all 50 states, and we feature in-depth state examples, model legislation, enacted policy text, and other resources for all states and policies. It's also accurate and regularly updated. This is another motivating factor for the dashboard. A lot of resources and policy trackers aren't always the most up to date, or they're not updated on a regular basis. So we do both to ensure that it's the most accurate resource available on climate policy. This tool is also collaborative. We could not have done this all on our own. We feature resources from over 100 organizations. That's anything from greenhouse gas emissions data to specific resources to providing some policy information across states, and then also crowdsource some policy tracking and information from people like you, people in the network, on SCPN calls or via feedback, news alerts, policy tracking software, all of that. So really compiling a ton of information, a ton of resources to provide you the best tool available. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we track 62 state-level policies across all 50 states. These policies span 7 policy areas, the first being climate governance and equity. This focuses on how states are approaching climate planning, how they're setting greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, addressing environmental justice, and ensuring a just transition for all residents. Next is cross-sector. These policies focus on economy-wide emission reductions, so green banks and carbon pricing. Our electricity policy area includes policies like clean energy standards, which it sounds like people are very interested in, renewable portfolio standards, net metering, interconnection, coal phase-outs, and more. Buildings and efficiency focuses on policies such as energy codes, building performance standards, energy efficiency resource standards, weatherization. Transportation includes low emission vehicle standards, zero emission vehicle sales requirements, EV rebates, EV charging infrastructure requirements, low carbon fuel standards, active transportation, and more. Industry, materials, and waste management includes policies such as Buy Clean, a couple F-gas regulations, fracking bans, methane regulations, and food waste. And lastly, natural and working lands includes agricultural financial incentives and technical assistance programs. Next slide, please. I hope by now you've all checked out the dashboard. And if you're familiar with our previous version of it, this map should look somewhat familiar, different shape, so no longer a geographic map. But the concept of this map is the same. It's to kind of contextualize policy progress on climate across the country. Darker shades on this map represent more policies enacted, whereas the lighter shades show fewer policies enacted. At this point, we just highlight policy occurrence, so whether it's been enacted or not. And this map doesn't really reflect policy quality across states, but kind of just a really high level snapshot of progress across states. As I mentioned, we use a ton of different policy tracking methods. A lot of it is crowdsourced. We use Quorum as a policy tracking software. We have 11 contributor organizations and feature over 100 more, and a lot of secondary research. We've incorporated a lot of feedback from the previous version of the dashboard into this new one, and have all of this information and more on our dashboard's methodology page, which you can find under the About in the top menu on the site. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over 5 key features, both just really quickly in these slides, and then in a more thorough screen sharing walkthrough of the dashboard. The first that's really exciting is being able to identify state-specific policy opportunities, visualizing greenhouse gas emissions and projections through 2050, being able to compare policies across states and sectors and statuses, exploring model rules, state examples, and key resources for given policies, and being able to directly request technical assistance from Climate XChange through the dashboard site, as Kristen mentioned. Next slide, please. So first up, being able to identify state-specific policy opportunities. Like I said, you're able to explore information on 62 climate policies across states, including the status. So before, on the old dashboard, we kind of just had enacted or not enacted. Now we have 4 different statuses, including partially enacted and in progress. The first is enacted, and that just means the policy exists and is on the books in the state. In progress means that it's either being established but pending final approval, or that legislation or executive orders kind of require that policy to be put into effect. So an example is Oregon passed legislation in 2022 that requires the state to develop an environmental justice mapping tool by next September. So that's an example of a policy in progress. It's required by law to be developed, but is still in progress. Next is partially enacted. So this, we have a handful of policies that are have components. These are coming from Spot for Clean Energy and the League of American Bicyclists. And so this is kind of breaking a single policy into more detailed components. Partially enacted means that some components are fulfilled while others are not. And not enacted means that the policy does not exist in the state. Next slide, please. So really briefly, the homepage map is one way to explore the statuses across states. If you hover over any state, you're able to see like a very brief snapshot of progress in that state across those 4 statuses. Next slide, please. Next, another new feature is being able to visualize state greenhouse gas emissions and projections through 2050. This data is coming from RMI and Energy Innovations Energy Policy Simulator. It's a great tool. You're able to model the impact of various policies on state level emissions and see the benefits of those policies in terms of job creation, GDP, public health, and more. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot of Arizona. It's a bit unique right now. It has 2 graphs. That's the plan for all states, all 48 contiguous states, I should clarify. Eventually, but most states right now will just have 1 graph showing business as usual emissions through 2050. Next slide, please. Next, being able to compare policies across states and sectors. This was another big request from all of you, being able to sort and filter states and policies. This can mean anything from by status, year enacted, region, policy area, and more. Both on state pages and policy pages, we have those filtering and sorting capabilities. Next slide. I believe this includes a screenshot. Yep, so this is an example of, I believe, Pennsylvania. We have all policy statuses selected and then filtered by electricity. So just seeing a snapshot of electricity policy in the state. Next slide. Lastly, 2 other features include being able to explore model rules, state example, and key resources. Those all live on policy pages. This includes model rule texts, which can be like template policies to kind of plug in state-specific information, as well as accessing all of those 100+ contributor resources I mentioned, such as reports, maps, databases, toolkits, and more. And then lastly, all policy pages feature a button to request technical assistance directly from Climate Exchange, either from Climate Exchange staff or connecting you all with relevant experts and advocates in the SCPN. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot of some key resources, model rules, and model states on policy pages. So not all policy pages will feature model rules, but all will feature key resources and model states. And hopefully over time, we're able to develop more model rules as well, but not all policies will have them at this point. Next slide. This is another snapshot of a policy page. So you can see there's a kind of state-specific summary of that policy, as well as the establishing policies, the year as well, and then the establishing policies linked directly to the bill text, regulations, executive orders, all of that, to make all that information that can be kind of hard to find really accessible for all of you. Another feature includes a 50-state map with the 4 different statuses shown for each policy. So you're able to really quickly see the landscape of a certain policy across all states. Next slide, please. And lastly, the feature I'm most excited about is the state comparison tool. It's brand new. You're able to select up to 4 states and compare as many policies as you want. Across those 4 states can be any combination of policies, any combination of states, and you're able to just kind of see those the status and description of those policies across states. So really quickly being able to see how policies vary across the country. We also include the model states for all the policies, and you can directly go from this page either back to state pages or to policy pages to learn more. I believe that's the last slide for the presentation. Now I can jump into screen sharing and kind of walking through an example of how to use the dashboard to answer some questions. Let me see. Okay, is that good? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so if you haven't explored the tool yet, this is the homepage. Right front and center, you can go see our methodology, and here's the homepage map that I mentioned with definitions of all of those policy statuses. You can also find these definitions and a lot more in our glossary. We also want to make all of our various terms that we use widely understood as well. So just a couple examples. I might hover over New York. You can see they've made a lot of progress, 42 enacted policies. So they are one of the darker shades on the map. Maryland's a good example of a state with all 4 policy statuses. They have 4 in progress, largely due to an executive order issued this year that requires some state agencies to develop regulations, a couple that are partially enacted, and then 18 not enacted. If you go over to Indiana, for example, it's a lighter shade. There's 5 policies enacted, 0 in progress right now as we define it, 4 policies partially enacted, and then 53 not enacted. Also on the homepage, you're able to explore by policy area. If you click on one of these, it'll bring you to a policy area page that features kind of a description of that policy area, some resources, and provides a snapshot of the policies in that policy area. If you go to the See All Policies page, that's a really great place to see our entire policy framework, how it's grouped by policy area and categories, and kind of the progress across states. It'll tell you how many states have that policy enacted, or you're also able to search for a specific policy. So I might want to search environmental justice. We have 5 policies right now with that in the title. Or electric. We have all electric buildings, a couple EV policies, electric bus procurement targets, and more. And then lastly, if you do want to go straight to the state comparison tool, you're able to do that from the homepage as well. The last feature I'll focus on the homepage is the feedback form. So like I said, we really tried to incorporate a ton of feedback from the old dashboard into this new one. And if we're missing anything, if you have ideas for new policies, if something needs a correction, if you have a resource to be featured on the dashboard, you can use our feedback form and we'll take those into account. So one topic that's been getting a lot of attention lately has been electric school buses. The EPA just opened another round of funding through its Clean School Bus program last month. So far, almost $3 billion have been awarded out of this program to replace just under 9,000 school buses with zero emission clean school buses, which is great, but we can also kind of explore what the state landscape looks like for electric buses. So this is a policy page. Like I said, you can get there directly from the homepage. You can also get to it via the policy area pages or click on the policies link up here to take you to the full list. All policy pages feature a brief description to learn more about the policy. Here's the request policy assistance button as well. And the 50 state map. So it's kind of interesting that most states with this policy enacted are kind of clustered in the Northeast, and then California is kind of a standalone on the West Coast as well. This isn't a policy with any partially enacted or in progress states, so it's just the two colors, but a lot of state maps will have all four statuses as well. If you wanted to just jump right down, you don't care about resources or state examples or anything like that, you're able to do that. If you need a reminder for what these policies or the statuses mean, you can jump to the glossary. But here we have key resources, a brief description of what they are. Some are reports, some are toolkits, databases, all of that, along with the year and the source. Electric bus procurement targets doesn't have a model rule right now, but it would appear right here above model states if it did. And then lastly, here are a couple model states for this policy. All of them have a target of 100% zero emission or clean buses by a certain year. So in California, 100% of school buses need to be zero emission by 2035. In Connecticut, 100% of school buses are required to be zero emission by 2040. And Massachusetts also transit buses by 2040. So there's a big kind of variety in whether they focus on transit buses, school buses, or both. And a lot of states have different timelines for those as well. As I mentioned, you can also sort by policy status, by region. You can have a keyword search. For this example, I'm just going to filter by enacted and pull up those 7 states. I'm also going to filter by year. It's also interesting to note that all 7 of these states have passed this policy in the last 4 years. If you wanted to just learn more about one state, you could expand that, but I'm going to expand all of them right now to kind of get a broader overview. So this does include the same information with the model states, along with all states that have that policy enacted. Again, there's a kind of big variation in timelines and what buses fall under the policy. And yeah, a mix of also legislation. New York established this through their fiscal year 2023 budget. California has both a regulation and legislation to establish these targets. And it's also interesting to note that Connecticut is the only state that has a specific requirement in environmental justice communities. So kind of ensuring that communities with higher pollution burdens are benefiting from school bus electrification. That also kind of leads me to wonder, what are environmental justice communities? How are they defined in Connecticut? So I'm going to jump over to a state page. Same kind of general format. We have a brief description of the climate and energy context in the state, some political context, their most recent legislative session, some offices and links. The state has a climate change portal. Here's kind of, I wonder if I can fit it all in, a snapshot of climate policy in the state. So just above, we have the number of policies enacted or in progress. across 6 policy areas means that there's one policy area where the state doesn't have any policies enacted. And then policy opportunities represent those that are partially enacted or not enacted. You can also kind of see the progress relative to other states in the region. And the progress by policy area section provides another snapshot of progress in the state. So you can see natural and working lands is the area where no policies are enacted, and the state is making some progress on most other policy areas. In industry, there's only one policy enacted. So yeah, if you wanted to just go straight to one policy area, these are all clickable. I'm just going to keep going down the page. So here's what the emission projections look like in Connecticut under business as usual scenario. You can see that electricity, buildings, and transportation make up the bulk of the state's emissions, and that doesn't really change over time. They're still the largest share of emissions. And even though industry is a smaller section or a smaller portion of emissions, it does make up a chunk. And so kind of further evidence that, some progress in industry is needed. If you wanted to explore this on your own, we do link out to all state level models for the EPS. I think I saw someone from RMI in the chat, so feel free to connect with them, or we can put you in contact if you're interested in learning more. And now we get to kind of the meat of the state pages. So this table, I'm not going to scroll through all of it, but it does include all 62 climate policies. Again, you can filter or sort by status, by policy area. There's a keyword search. You could filter by year enacted, status. If you wanted it alphabetically, you could do that as well. But I am going to just search environmental justice, which is nicely already there for me. So like I said, Connecticut has a certain requirement that all school buses in environmental justice communities are electric school buses by 2030. So I'm interested in learning more about environmental justice communities in the state. You can see that the state does have EJ communities defined from 2012. And it's kind of a simple definition of environmental justice communities. It only takes income into account, whereas other states incorporate race, pollution burden, language proficiency, etc. The state does also have 2 mapping tools to kind of visualize and identify EJ communities in the state as recent as 2023. And then even though it does have that specific investment requirement for school buses, it doesn't have an overall investment requirement in environmental justice communities. So that is shown as not enacted, and for all policies not enacted, we just provide a very brief overview and description of what that policy is instead of the state-specific information. Like I said, the definition is kind of a simple one, only taking into account income. And so I'm going to go up to the state comparison tool, which you can either get to directly from the state page or up from the menu. And here I'm going to select Connecticut. Massachusetts was also a model state for electric bus procurement targets. It neighbors Connecticut, so I'm going to select that one as well. And then for another research project, I recently learned that North Carolina has the 5th highest school bus vehicle miles traveled across the country. So I'm interested in seeing if that state has anything around electric bus requirements. I'm going to select climate governance and equity for the environmental justice policies and transportation. This step isn't necessary, but it does narrow down the list of policies but you're still able to kind of search the list here. So I'll do EJ community definitions, mapping tools, investment requirements, and then I'm just gonna type in bus. So here we go. This is why I'm so excited, because you can see really easily just the kind of difference in policies across states, both the status and the year, but kind of just how they vary. So Connecticut, like I mentioned, only defines EJ communities based on income. Massachusetts includes race, English proficiency, and income. And North Carolina includes race and income in their definition. All three states have EJ mapping tools. North Carolina is the most recent. It was about a month or two ago, I believe. We link out to those as well. No state right now that I've selected has an EJ community investment requirement. And then you can kind of see, so North Carolina does not have electric bus procurement target. It has received some federal funding for that and allocated some state funding as well, but no kind of state policy driving that. It's solely based on funding allocations. And like I said, in Connecticut, the policy focuses on school buses, whereas in Massachusetts, it focuses on transit buses for the MBTA specifically. Since no state has an EJ community investment requirement, I am going to pull up one of these model states, since New York is a model state for 3 of these policies. I'm just going to quickly add that to highlight an example of an investment requirement. So there you go. It's easily updated. You could just clear all of this and select new states, new policies, all of that. And so New York has a EJ community investment requirement requiring at least 35% of climate investments benefiting disadvantaged communities, which you can see is kind of a much more robust definition. It includes 45 different indicators based on environmental burden, socioeconomic data, climate vulnerabilities, and more into its definition. So yeah, that kind of brings me to the end of the example. I see we have a ton of questions. I'm also happy to walk through the other state comparison tool example. The last thing I'll flag is everything, whether you're on a policy page, a state page, if you sort or filter, or for this page specifically, the comparison tool, whatever your selections are, there is a unique URL, which is great and makes sharing really easy. There is also, it's not on this page, but on state pages and policy pages, there is the ability to download the either state or policy information. You can download our entire database. And lastly, all pages include when the page was last updated. So we launched last week, and data is up to date as of about a month ago.
Thank you so much, Ruby. Real quick, could you walk us through how someone would request policy assistance or give feedback on the state policies that they see?
Sure. I'll just go to EJ community definitions. So you can either click the request policy assistance, which will bring you right to this form. You'll just have to give us your name and email. If it is for policy assistance, you can just type your message. It could be anything from, could you share more about the landscape of this policy? Even though that was another really popular request from the old dashboard. So we did try and kind of make that a lot more apparent on the new site, but that's one way. There's also, this is the same as the feedback form. So if you wanted to report and share a new resource with me. It could be, you could change it to feedback, but it is kind of the same form. Another way to do that, in the lower banner for all pages, there's this tell us about it button. This will bring you to that feedback form as well. And I'll send my email in the chat because you can also directly email me. Let's see.
Yeah, our dashboard is, as we said, involves crowdsourced information. And so any and all feedback you have for us, please let us know if there's updates to your state data or if something is framed differently than you understand it. Just feel free to let us know. I will go ahead. We voted in the beginning on what policies and states people would like to compare using the state comparison tool. So we can go back to that and I'll give you those states and policies, Ruby, and then we can get into the Q&A. So if you have a question and you haven't yet asked it, feel free to do that. We've been answering those as we can throughout the webinar as well, just typing out those answers. But all right, we're here on the state comparison tool. The most popular states were Washington, Massachusetts, Colorado, and Michigan. So we can go to those ones. Slowly but surely.
What was the last one?
Michigan.
Okay.
And then the two policies are CES, RPS, and GHG targets, which are great ones to compare across states.
Greenhouse gas targets. And I will just note, if you're like searching for an abbreviation and it doesn't match our policy titles, it might show up as no results. So just be aware of that. Okay, here we go. I'm just gonna expand them all. So again, this is not really representative of the entire country. All 4 states have both of these policies enacted. You can see all of them have net zero targets by 2050. All of them are pretty recent, within the last 4 years as well. Colorado is the only state that has targets for every 5 years, starting 2025 through 2050. And that was established through this 2023 legislation. You can see, I guess only one is a model state. So Colorado is also a model state because of those 5-year incremental targets. And Michigan is the only state with this policy established through an executive order and not through legislation as the other 3 states. In terms of clean energy and renewable portfolio standards, there's also some variation here. So Colorado, Michigan, and Washington all have 100% clean or renewable requirements by certain years. In Colorado, it depends on the utility type, but 100% clean energy for investor-owned utilities serving more than 500,000 people by 2050. Michigan, it's 100% clean energy by 2040, and there's some incremental targets that incorporate both renewable and clean energy as well. And Washington has some pretty strong targets, including 100% greenhouse gas neutral by 2030 and 100% renewable or zero emitting energy by 2045. Massachusetts, even though it does have some strong climate targets, does not have really the strongest renewable portfolio standard, only requiring 40% by 2050. And yeah, all of them pretty recent as well. Also kind of a mix. Washington's is the only model state we have on our policy page that's here in this example. Yeah, and then I might just change up some states to show you. I don't know, I'll pick Florida. So instead of all 4 states having these policies enacted, you can see that Florida has not made progress on either of these policies.
Alrighty, thank you so much. I think we can stop sharing and go into some Q&A. You all have been asking amazing questions, and thank you so much. We've been trying to answer those as we can. And I'm just going to ask some of the questions that are being, like, more than one person has asked each of those questions. So first, kind of broadly, how did we select the 62 policies that we track? And is there a plan to grow this list? Is there a way for people to suggest other topic areas relevant to climate policy? But yeah, anything in and around that.
Yes, and I did just pull up. We went through a pretty robust process to develop this framework. It started with kind of first just compiling a list of every single climate policy we could think of. It didn't need to fall into a specific policy area or a certain topic, just we wanted to cover our bases with as much as possible. From there, we did a lot of research on kind of the landscape of those policies, what they look like across states. Is it feasible for all states to work on this policy? Is it broadly applicable? Does it exist anywhere? We do have a handful of policies where they're kind of newer policies, not many states have them, but all policies on the dashboard, at least one state needs to have that policy enacted. From there, we did kind of reevaluate our existing framework, so that had around 65 policies, but we readjusted the framework. So Climate XChange is a mitigation focused organization on state level policy. So we decided to kind of shift away from adaptation and resilience. There's a ton of great resources and organizations working on that. If you are interested, the Georgetown Climate Center Adaptation Clearinghouse is a great resource. They have a lot of the same information, like policy updates and resources specifically on those topics. So yeah, we kind of looked at this list, looked at the landscape across states. We did want to include as many policies from our old dashboard onto the new one if it kind of fell within scope. And then from there kind of assessed what are the top policies that we're missing from the current framework. And so, yeah, kind of assessed the landscape and the relative importance and impact of a lot of these policies. And yes, we have a list of 40 or 50 right now, and that's without kind of opening the floor to all of you to see what other policies you're interested in. So if you do have ideas, you can go to that feedback form on the website. You can email me and or Kristen with those ideas. Because yeah, we want to make this robust, comprehensive, and really useful for all of you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We can also, there's questions around model rules and who those are developed by or contributed to by, and model states and what has, yeah, I guess the selection processes for model rules and model states and where those come from.
Yeah, most model laws come from the Legal Pathways for Deep Decarbonization. Their website's lpdd.org. They develop model laws with a network of lawyers that are peer reviewed and kind of create template policies where you're able to plug in state specific information. They have one for clean energy standards. You're able to set specific years and targets, I believe, plug in state specific information. So they have a really robust list of model laws. They have a ton more that we don't feature on the dashboard just because we don't currently track those policies, but it's a great resource and I recommend checking that out. There's a couple others from other organizations that are more topic or policy specific, ones such as interconnection standards, or community choice aggregation, kind of just, yeah, crowdsourcing information from other organizations that they're kind of really an expert in the space. In terms of model policies, a lot of that was conducted in-house, doing a really thorough investigation of these policies, open to feedback on that as well. But yeah, kind of using the dashboard data and our knowledge, kind of highlighting exemplary states or exemplary aspects of a certain policy.
Great, thanks so much. And yeah, we have a ton of dashboard contributors on the website, and you can see those organizations on the site as well. Over 100 contributor organizations, but I think we have like 11 dashboard contributors that are like really have intensely featured policies on the dashboard. Something that's really important to us is at Climate Exchange is deduplication. So there's tons of other orgs that are tracking sector-specific policies and have various resources and dashboards of their own that are useful, and we're not trying to duplicate efforts that already exist. So thank you for that question. Ruby, could you talk a little bit more about what partially enacted policies are and what that partially enacted means and the difference between that and in progress?
Yeah, and I can maybe pull one up to screen share as well. Let's see. Okay, you're back on the comparison tool, right? Yeah, okay. Let's see. Right now we have policies with components across electricity, buildings, and transportation. As you can see, if you're on a policy area page or the all policies page, you can see really quickly just which policies have components. Maybe I'll highlight net metering because it's a bit of a unique example. So you might be alarmed and saying, oh my God, no states have net metering right now. That's only because the policies are broken down into components. And so I'll click on that right now. This is a policy where we incorporate spot for clean energies, policy components, and data. There, maybe Kristen, if you could send the link in the chat. They're another great organization, have a ton of great resources and in-depth policy components. So here you can see that no state has all policy components fulfilled. They're all this kind of striped shade or not enacted. So 45 states, they're partially enacted, meaning they have some components fulfilled, but not all. Net metering is another unique example on the dashboard. Spot has 2 net metering policies, and we kind of lump them into one. And so that's another main reason why it's saying 0 states have the policy enacted. Some might fulfill all components of one policy or the other, but not both. But you can see the policy components. Net metering is also a unique example. It's 11 components combining the 2 policies, but most will have between 4 and 6 components. Key resources, we link right out to Spot's net metering and aggregate net metering policies for specific states. And so you can see like a lot of states are really close to having that enacted, but are missing just one specific component. You can hover over the bars to see what that is. I'm not sure if it shows up on screen sharing. And so all of these states have 10 out of 11 components. In California, for example, and Pennsylvania, it does have all 5 or 6 components of one policy, but not the other. So it's, yeah, kind of breaking down the policies into more specific aspects of that. So not only just does it exist, but our all eligible resources in net metering, eligible for aggregate net metering? Is it capped? Does it apply to all types of utilities? That type of thing. Trying to get more at like evaluating quality and progress. I can also maybe show one where there is states with that policy. So weatherization funding, there's a lot more variety in the map, even though there are still 44 states with it partially enacted. There are 5 states with all 4 components fulfilled. Here are the components, again, pulled from Spot for Clean Energy's website. And you can see that some model states do have all components fulfilled. So that means it's no longer partially enacted, it is enacted for the status. And we link out to the state-specific pages for the policy as well. Here you can see there's a lot of variety in like both progress, even though most are partially enacted. There's a lot of variation in what components of the 4 states do have enacted.
Great, thank you so much, Ruby. The next question has been asked by a couple of people. I think this will be our last question because we're coming up on the end of our time here, but really some questions about how we see this tool being used to enact change. Who are our target audiences? How can we push for the dashboard to be used for greater climate policy progress? And before handing it over to Ruby, I'll just say, I think it's a really, really useful tool for for folks that are working on developing legislation or executive orders, regulations, and things like that, to see what other states have done, especially states with similar policy context to them. That's why we have sort of those summary blurbs and political context at the top of every state page. I always say at the SCPN, someone somewhere has done what you're trying to do, and I think the dashboard really helps you go exactly to like, what is the policy that I'm trying to craft look like in other states? What does my state's climate policy landscape look like, and where are there places that we can do, we can push for further change? I think also, especially for policies with components or in progress, that shows that those are kind of policies to keep an eye on in terms of where the state is going. And then I think it's a really powerful tool for communication, especially with elections coming up, but also just in general, to really show those maps with like a snapshot of what the country looks like with different sorts of climate policies, or what your state looks like with different sorts of climate policies. I think it's a really useful and easy to use tool for folks that aren't necessarily in the weeds of climate policy every day. So a lot about accessibility and data democratization, but I'll hand it over to you, Ruby.
Yeah, sure. Just to follow up a little bit more, we've had the old dashboard used by all different types of actors, researchers, legislators, people working in the executive branch, and advocates, national NGOs, all of that. And so we see that trend continuing. I think there's a lot of different use cases, like Kristen said. A main one is just being able to kind of understand your state's context, and then also see how that varies, maybe by region, maybe by similar energy profiles, similar policy progress, all of that, and kind of bringing in climate policy design and ideas from other states into your state. So that's something we've done through the policy assistance program as well, using our knowledge of policy across all 50 states to kind of craft policy and bills before. But yeah, I think it's a really powerful tool to understand where your state's currently at and where there's an opportunity to make more progress. Another feature that only lives on Arizona's page right now, is identifying key policy opportunities. And so just being able to have the work done of identifying what are the most impactful policies in your state, that can be either making existing policies more ambitious, or if your state doesn't have much on the books, being able to identify where are kind of the hardest hitting, most impactful policies.
Alrighty, great. I think we are gonna have to end there. Please feel free to reach out to us with any feedback or questions. I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. If this event was useful or if the information provided was helpful, please do let us know. And yeah, thank you so much. I've sent the link in the chat to join a State Climate Policy Network national call next week. We have those calls monthly where different states will join and give updates on what's the latest in climate policy in their state. We would be nothing without our State Climate Policy Network members who really provide the on the ground updates and ground truthing for everything that we do. So thank you all so much for being here. We will be sharing a recording with slides by email by the end of the week, and they'll be posted to our website as well. So thank you so much again. You all have my email because you registered for this event, but I'll send it one more time. Please let us know how the tool is useful in your work. Feel free to circulate the tool throughout your networks, and we love to hear kind of how folks are using it and any feedback they have. So please let us know, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We look forward to your feedback.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close it out. Thanks all.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.